welcome to another night of great decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. Great to see so many people turn out tonight. That's fantastic. As always, I'd like to start the evening by thanking our wonderful sponsors. So here we go. The League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Friends of Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and the University of Wisconsin-Manitowoc. Now, every week that the series has been running this session in 2018, at this point you've heard me going over fundraisers and pleas for donations. Instead, this time, I thought I would mix it up just a little bit because it's someone very special's birthday today. And this is someone who is actually responsible for getting the ball rolling to bring great decisions to Manitowoc. So we thought we'd bring the cake out now.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And I don't think it's out of line to sing happy birthday. So happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Darlene. Happy birthday to you.
What do you say to that? My goodness, thank you so much. This is a wonderful thing that we're doing here. I just love this, and I just love to see all of you here week after week after week, and year after year after year. And I think this is a real credit to our community that we have this kind of interest and that we can get the quality of speakers and the kind of discussion rolling here each time. And so I'm very happy that, you know, Great Decisions is here. And Marilyn Sontag and I were the spearheading of this, and then of course the library was and all the other people, but Marilyn deserves a lot of credit too. So
when it's her birthday, there will be more cake. But without further ado, I would now like to turn the microphone over to Connie Hendries, who will be introducing our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
And before I do that, which is my real pleasure, because we're always happy to see Professor Klug return to Manitowoc. We get him whenever it has anything to do with Africa or places that he is from, which would be South Africa. And before I do that, I would like to put in a little plug for a candidates forum that the League of Women Voters is holding on Thursday at City Hall at 7 o'clock in the City Council chambers. It's for Bob Ziegelbauer and Eric Sikowitz, who are both running for county executive. And I promise you a lively discussion and a really fun evening. Take it from me. Okay. So, and now before we go any further into cutting into Professor Klug's time, he gave me a little bio, which I'm going to try and work my way through. Short. Okay. Well, actually, his real life is a lot more interesting than what's on this piece of paper, I'll tell you. He was born in South Africa and grew up there as a white person under apartheid. And his passion when he got into college suddenly turned to being anti-apartheid. And that's how he spent most of the next 20 years or so, including 11 years when he was in exile in Botswana because his life was in danger. And he was in charge of student press and student news services. And the places where he was working were actually blown up while he was out of town. So his life was really in danger, and he's had a very interesting life. But right now, He is the Evu Bascom Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an honorary visiting professor in the School of Law at the University of Witwatersrand. Say that for me. Witwatersrand, okay. Johannesburg, South Africa. Yes, obviously.
It's not Afrikaans, it's Dutch.
Okay. I should have asked you ahead of time how to say that. Growing up in Durban, South Africa, he participated in the anti-apartheid struggle, spent 11 years in exile in Botswana and the United States, and returned to South Africa in 1990 as a member of the ANC Land Commission and researcher for the chairperson of the ANC Constitutional Committee. In slightly different words, he was a consultant to the people who were writing the new constitution for the Union of South Africa. I think that explains it a little more clearly. Okay. He received his BA at the University of Natal in Durban, and he later attended the University of California, Hastings College of Law, earning a J.D. in 1989, and the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he obtained an S.J.D. in December 1997. S.J.D. means he got a doctorate in research, and that's a higher than, how would you describe that? It's a higher level, PhD in law, okay. Professor Klug began teaching law at the University of Witwatersrand. Hey, got it. In 1991, before becoming an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School in 1996. What in the world brought him here, I ask. I hear you cry. Well, he met a woman in Botswana. And she just happened to be from Madison, Wisconsin. Need I say more? And they're still there 20 years later. Okay, 25 years later. Okay. He's published widely in the areas of constitutionalism, land reform, and human rights, including 3 books. His research interests include constitutionalism, constitutional transition, constitution building, property, and human rights, and he's also interested in water and marine rights. Oh, big topic locally. Okay. So, without any further ado, I turn it over to one of our all-time favorite speakers, Professor Klug.
Very kind of you. Well, thank you. That's very generous. And I do love coming to Manitowoc, so I look forward to this evening. What I'm going to do, so I'll do a short introduction. What I'm going to do with the slides is what you'll see is some of them I'm just going to flip through. They're just images that I want to give you an impression of different things. And others I'll stick with it while I talk to it and let you know a little bit more about it. That's the map of South Africa today. I want you to pay attention particularly to the different provinces. There's 9 provinces or states, what we'd see as states in the United States, that make up South Africa today. And that's the flag which we call the Y front. There was a compromised flag at the time of the transition. I'm going to do a short introduction, talk about the origins of South Africa's democracy, and then talk about the constitutional structure, the 1996 Constitution, and the building of institutions, because institutions are key to any democratic order. And then once I've discussed that construction of those institutions, I'm going to talk about the conditions that have produced the fragility that comes with the title of today's talk. And then I'll talk a little bit about the political process, what's been ongoing, the struggles that have been going on in South Africa. Some of you may have noticed, but in February we got a new president. Not elected by the regular national election process, but is now interim until the election takes place in 2019, and then can still serve 2 terms after that. But so we're into our 5th president in South Africa, and Democratic president, and I'll describe that as we go through. And then I'm going to end by talking about the problem of corruption that has driven a lot of this process, and something we call state capture. And I'll give you a sense of what the difference between regular old corruption is and this thing called state capture. And then finally, I'll conclude with a conclusion which I think is a little counterintuitive. I'm going to talk about the resilience of democratic institutions. That despite this incredible struggle we've had over the institutions, how resilient some of these institutions actually are turning out to be. And at least I hope they will be. For the moment, this appointment of this new president, in fact, indicates that it's a slightly hopeful turn at the end. So if this is the structure, if this is the map of South Africa today, we have to go back a little bit and say, well, where did we come from, right? Because democracy, a new political order doesn't come from nowhere. What happened to that? That's no good. Okay. So there's the old map of South Africa, the one that was still in place in 1994, which was when our first democratic elections take place, right? So you could flip back to the one before and you see the 9 different states. You go forward and what you effectively have got is what we had was 4 provinces in apartheid South Africa, plus these 10 little areas. Now what's important about those areas, that's the so-called, again in South Africa, everything has a different name because it depends on the politics, right? So they were called by the government homelands, they were called by the population Bantustans, depended on one's perspective. But those areas were initially what were called native reserves. No different, and in fact coming out of the same history as the Indian reserves right here in the state of Wisconsin, right? This was reserved land out of the colonial period. And that reserved land equals about 13% of the land mass. And that 13% was supposed to be the homeland, according to the apartheid regime, of 80% of the population. Right? So that was where it went. Those areas are significant coming forward because they're still there. They're still the poorest parts of South Africa. They're no longer, as you can see, they're no longer separate parts of the country, right? With separate governments, etc., which is what they set up under apartheid. They are now integrated into these 9 provinces, but they are the poorest areas of those 9 provinces, by far. And you'll see later, I'll show you some indicators because it explains some of what drives the populist politics that we've just been through under Jacob Zuma. So this is I just found these 2 portraits because they do quite well in terms of just giving you an impression, right? We came out of this history of colonialism, a history of brutality, and that period, that struggle against apartheid was a long history. One of the most famous photos is this photo. This is June 16, 1976, and that young boy that's being carried is Hector Peterson, who was the first child killed by the police on the streets of Soweto in 1976. The children were demonstrating, again, these were school kids who were demonstrating against the fact that the government had just decided that all their classes would be taught both in English and in Afrikaans. Separate classes would be taught in these 2 different languages, both of which were not the languages that they were not their home languages, and they were protesting against that burden, and they were peacefully protesting, and the police opened fire with live ammunition. By the end of this uprising, over 800 people had been slaughtered on the streets. And that, 1976, was the beginning, the point at which this long struggle against apartheid began to turn around. At that point, the government was starting to lose control. It took from 76 to 1994 before that shift had finally taken place. But that is one of the most famous photos out of the South African conflict. This is in the 1980s. children on the streets again, but at this point, the wave has shifted in the late 1980s, and very shortly thereafter, Nelson Mandela is finally released from prison. This was the day of the release, and now he was released in February 1990. We didn't have democratic elections until April 1994, right? So that was really the point when the negotiations began. It was also from a period just before this, from late 1985, when the state started putting in states of emergency, that we had 20,000 dead between 1985 and 1994. So one of the myths of South Africa is that we had this peaceful transition. It was only peaceful to the extent that we didn't have the bloodbath that we probably would have had otherwise. But 20,000 dead is not insignificant, right? So it was a lot of that 20,000 was involved in interscene fighting in KwaZulu-Natal, which happens to be my home province. And in that area, the old regime had funded these forces that came out of the Bantustan in that area, the homeland in that area. And it was done surreptitiously, it wasn't done publicly, and they armed them and they attacked civilians, etc. during that period. So that was a pretty nasty period, but this was the break when Mandela was finally released. And it went on from there. So here's our election in 1994, and I'll talk later a little bit about that period between 1990 and 1994, because that is the period of the negotiations for the interim constitution, and I'll talk about the constitutional process in a moment. This is the votes for the first time in 1994. People are voting for the first time in their lives. And this election took place April 26th to 29th, 1994. And it took a long time to get that date, right? Because the old regime was determined, after 1990, as they opened up the political process, was determined to control it into the future. They wanted to control what the future would look like. And it took a series of massacres, a breakdown in the negotiations, and finally the assassination of one of the most senior ANC leaders, a man by the name of Chris Hani, to put the government in a position where they were so on the back foot that they had to agree to a date for an election. The country was about to burn. And at that point they agreed, and the election went off very peacefully. There were a lot of parties standing. That was the ballot. That's the original ballot of 1994. And these aren't for individuals. These are political parties, because this was a proportional ballot, right? So unlike in the United States, the electoral system in South Africa is a proportionality system. So you vote only for the party. And the seats in the national legislature are distributed according to the percentage of the vote that the party receives. Right? So, yeah, you've got Mandela's face over there, but those are the faces of the leaders of all the different parties that were standing for election at that time. And most of them didn't make it at all into Parliament. They just didn't. There was a slight cut-off that they had to make. Most of them didn't make it, but a number of, three major parties come out of this election. The African National Congress, which is Mandela's party, gets 54% of the vote. The National Party, which was the old apartheid government party, got 33% of the vote. And the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is the party of Chief Buthelezi, got 4.5% of the vote. So that was the distribution of the vote in this election. The parliament, the new parliament that had been created by the interim constitution, had a 400-seat legislature, and the votes were thus transformed into these proportional numbers in the legislature. So the first democratic legislature had 252 ANC members, 82 National Party members, and 43 IFP members. There was also a higher house, a Senate, called like the Senate here, but that didn't come from the states like our senators do. They were initially elected also on a party basis, just proportionately put in place. Later, today, we have something called the National Council of Provinces, which kind of harks back to that original US Senate, which used to actually represent the states, right? They weren't elected, but the senators originally in the United States were appointed by the legislatures of the state governments. Right? And they went there to represent the states. And that's what we have in South Africa today. The National Council of Provinces, the higher house, actually has 10 members from each province. So it's same kind of equality like we do in the US, but it's 10 members from each province sent by the legislature of the province and actually accountable to the legislature. So it's a slightly different, it's not popularly elected in the same way. Here's a famous photo, I think when they won the Nobel Prize together, and that's F.W. de Klerk, the last white president of South Africa, who was interesting because he came from the conservative side of the old apartheid party. He was incredibly conservative in his youth and would never have imagined that moment, and was put in a position through the 80s as the resistance built that eventually he was the one who did the deal, right, who agreed to open up the political process. They didn't have much choice. The country was basically bankrupt. And the United States had imposed sanctions in 1986. The international banks were refusing to roll over their loans, and that was the point at which they started to talk. They were not interested in talking beforehand. But Mandela comes out, and they agree to a government of national. So what happens is the first period, South Africa's transition takes place in two parts. The first part is a government of national unity under the interim, what something's called the interim constitution. So the first constitution gets negotiated, and it's an interim constitution that's to last with a government of national unity for 5 years. And during that period, the democratically elected legislature, which we just talked about, was going to now write a new constitution. Right? So it's a two-step process. The first step, a negotiated agreement to allow a democratic process, and then the democratic process to produce a final constitution. That's what we have in place. Again, just to show you, those are those 9 provinces that come out of this process, and this was the old structure without all those little Bantustans put in place. There's another complication to South Africa, of course, and that's language. I just wanted to give you a sense of that. The new South Africa recognizes 11 official languages. Right? There they are, but what you also notice is if you look at the different languages, isiZulu, 23.8%, isiXhosa, 17.6%, but then it goes down from there. Right? Afrikaans is interesting. 13.3% of the country speaks Afrikaans. Most people assume those are white people, but they're not. They're white people and brown people. Right? They're people of color in South Africa who grew up, basically the people who were enslaved from 1652. Right? There was a group, and those people basically, still today, Afrikaans is their first language. Afrikaans is a Dutch Creole. And it's a very creative language, etc. But it also became the language that was hated by the majority because it was the language of the white police, of the white forces that oppressed, right? So it was very contradictory. Today it's recognized as a national language, and it's going to survive. There's no question about that. And some of the languages like Indebele or Chivenda, very small percentages of people. But all equally recognized. The problem, of course, is how do you run a country with 11 languages? And so what happens is each of the provinces chooses 2 languages, official languages for the province. And usually one language is functional. The worst thing of all, of course, is that my language, which is English, is the dominant language for business and government. So for anybody in the country today, they're going to want to learn English, whatever other language they learn or speak. Right? So English dominates in South Africa. So here is the photo, and it's a very useful photo today because the man standing next to Mandela is Cyril Ramaphosa, who has just been elected president of South Africa. He's standing there at that time because Cyril was also, at that time, he's a lawyer who was the Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers, the largest black union during those 1980s, during the struggle to end apartheid. He then went on, he was elected to the first parliament, and he was elected as chairperson of the Constitutional Assembly. So the parliament, the legislature, the lower house, plus the Senate, sat together as a joint body to be the constitution writing body. So just like Philadelphia, our constitutional moment here, this was the South African equivalent of those two bodies sitting together. Unlike Philadelphia, that was done in public and by an elected body, but it was a different era, right? Different period. Here's Mandela finally signing the final constitution on the 10th of December 1996. Symbolically, and there's a lot of symbol in how South Africa plays, symbolically the signing takes place at Sharpeville. Sharpeville is a out of the way little place, but Sharpeville was where 69 people were killed by the police in 1960, and which set off the first state of emergency and set off the moment when the African National Congress and the other black parties were declared illegal by the white government. So that's the place where on the 10th of December 1996 they signed the Constitution. But as I say, it's a useful photo because Cyril has just been elected president of the country. So what about that constitution making process? Right? So what I've said already, the first part of the process was this negotiations. And it's a problem. Right? If you're going to have a constitution in the 21st century, the idea it should come from the people, so it should come through a democratic process. But if you've got two parties that have been battling with each other, like was the case in South Africa, those parties, the dominant party militarily was still the white party. It wasn't going to agree to have a national election and then a constitution that it has no say in. Right? That was just wasn't on the table. And so the first negotiation is going to be a negotiated constitution. But that doesn't have legitimacy for the majority. Right? Why on earth should we be bound by something that has been thrust upon us? And so the trick that was developed was to have this two-stage process. To agree to initially have a negotiated, what was called the interim constitution, which was negotiated between 1992 and 1993. Right? So the first negotiation process, which started with something called CODESA in the end of 1991, collapsed in mid-1992. Things were very, very violent and very rough in that period, and they got back to the negotiating table in late 92, early 93, and then through the period from April 93 to December 93, they negotiated this interim constitution. And that interim constitution provided that there would be a constitutional assembly, an elected, so the new elected body would write a final constitution within a period of 2 years. But, of course, because nobody's going to, you think about it, if you're the white minority party, you're not going to just let it go like that. And the majority, and Mandela recognized that wasn't going to be possible either. And if you wanted people to be comfortable, and Mandela was the person who was going to fight for reconciliation, and the fact that he spent 27 years in jail put him in a position that he could say, if I can reconcile, so can you youngsters, right? That's what he said to us. You behave yourselves. He was an old patriarch. He was a wonderful man, but he was an old patriarch. And his position was, if we're going to build a new country, we need to buy, everybody needs to buy in. Everybody needs to come on board, right? And the idea was this new constitution, we would get change. We would get equality in South Africa, but it would be through constitutional means. It wouldn't be through any other means. There would be no revolution. And they agree in this process that to a set of constitutional principles. That's an interesting problem. So we agree that the democratically elected constitutional making body, which is supposed to be free of all constraints, is not going to be free of all constraints. It's going to agree to write the Constitution in terms of this set of principles. And that was a wonderful move, because the moment we agreed to that there's going to be a set of principles, nobody worried about the details of the interim constitution. They were just worried about what the principles were going to say. Right? So everybody now invested in making sure those principles included what they wanted. But principles are drawn very broadly. Right? If you think of a set of principles, there's no detail. So you can get agreement on it because you might both agree to a principle where you have different understandings of what you think it's going to produce. Right? So you get these deals that are struck based on we both can live with what we think is going to come out of this. And that's exactly what happened. So we have this set of principles. But then, of course, as soon as we get this set of principles, how are we going to make sure that once you have a democratically elected body, it's going to stick by the principles? Well, what do we do with that? And so they said, look, okay, once we have these principles and this new constitution, draft constitution, then we would have created, under the interim constitution, a new constitutional court. Right? We're going to go the constitutionalist route. We're going to have a constitution that's bound by a court, like the United States, judicial review. We've gone further. We don't have the political question doctrine in South Africa. The court literally can decide on any issue, right, according to the Constitution. It has the final say. We don't debate it. It's in the Constitution. And we asked that court to look at the new text and decide whether the new text, in fact, met those principles. So here you had a constitution-making body, democratically elected, that submitted its product to a court of 11 judges and said to that court, did we do our job? So that was the process. And after 1990, after the election, the process of negotiation of that constitution took 2 years. And again, we fought bitterly over every little piece of it. And then eventually that product went to the Constitutional Court, which turned around at the end of the first hearing, because of course we all then went to the court and said, we don't agree with this part, that doesn't fit. The court had to resolve it. At the end of that decision, the court said you hadn't done your job. So the court said the Constitution was not constitutional. Sent it back to the Constitutional Assembly, that then had to fix the few things that the court had a problem with. And there were actually things about the court's power, fundamentally. Surprise, surprise. And sent it back to the court. And the court had a second chance to look at it. But by that point, the court realized they couldn't say no again. Right? That wouldn't have washed. But in fact, they met most of the conditions. In fact, all the conditions that the court had put in place. So that's the constitution-making process. It's this two-stage process, right, that finally produces in 1996 a final constitution. Retains the system of proportional representation and has all our hopes, right? So if you remember the last little one, it had all those horrendous images, and this one has all the hopes of 1994, the election, and then the new constitution in 1996. That somehow we're going to produce this new world. The constitution had a number of elements within it that were very important as a way to try and deal with that past and look to the future. In the postamble of the 93 Constitution, so it had a preamble but also a little postamble. In the postamble of the interim Constitution in 93, there was a promise that there would be amnesty given for past human rights violations. Of course, both sides had different interpretations of this. So when Mandela walked into his office on the first day on the job, there was a signed document lying on the desk left by dear F.W. de Klerk that gave general amnesty for the whole country for everything. Mandela said, we didn't agree to that. We agreed there would be amnesty, but there would be a process. not just a piece of document that said it's all disappeared. And so one of the things that happens after the what happens under the interim constitution is they establish something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the TRC gets established in July 1995, and it's one of those first institutions that's been created to try and address this past. And I'll say a little bit more about it in a moment. In March 95, so before the TRC gets established, the government establishes a commission on the restitution of land rights. If you remember that first picture I showed you of that 13% of the land, not only had that been the reserves that had been set out, but people who were living outside of those reserves, which is the vast majority of black South Africans, over the years from 1948, when apartheid was put in place, until 1990, many people had been forcefully removed and dumped into the areas because they were segregating the country. They were drawing the lines under apartheid where only certain people of certain races could live. But of course, you take a society that's been already developing over a few hundred years, and now you think you're going to make it clean on those terms, you're going to move people. So over 3.5 million people were forcefully removed from their homes and dumped elsewhere, or had their land taken away from them. So the first commitment to address that past was that there would be a recognition that anybody who lost their land after the June 13, 1913, June 13, 1913, which was when the Land Act went into force, the original Land Act, until 1990, would have a right to claim their land back, a right to restitution. That set in place a process. That body, the Restitution, the Claims Commission, Land Claims Commission, in fact, continues to work to this day. Right? Because some people thought, oh, well, courts, 5 years we can solve this. And as a lawyer, I looked at them and thought, oh, no, 50. And what do you mean 5? You've got to be joking. Because you put something like this in place, it's going to take time. And of course, the political pressures means that time always gets extended to deal with more issues. We had the first period, because they had, initially was 5 years in which people could make their claims. There were 65,000 claims lodged. Many of those 65,000 claims were community claims. So they weren't individuals, they were whole communities that had been forcefully removed. So thousands and thousands of claims within those. They resolved many of those claims by paying people out, right? Giving people a little bit of money, and people accepted it. But a lot of the big claims remained in place. They then reopened it, and it's now another whole set of claims have come in. And only now, beginning of this year, we're having the land debate all over again. Because 20x years later, the majority of land in South Africa is still owned by white people, who make up about 8% of the population. So that's the underlying issue, is inequality. And it isn't resolved, and that tension. So now there's a debate going on in Parliament in South Africa as we stand here, as I stand here, as you sit here, where they're talking about taking land without paying compensation. Which actually, despite what a lot of people say, is provided for in the new constitution. The new constitution provides that there shall be compensation for any taking of property. And then there's an exception for land reform, which they like to ignore. But the present government has also not implemented this over these 20 years. And part of that reason, of course, is because we have another country north of us called Zimbabwe. And after the mess they made of land reform, the South African government has been very, very careful in how it's progressed to try and address this issue. But my mother still lives in Durban, and she told me on Sunday that they got an SMS. You have SMSs, you're a text, right? She got a text, as did all the elderly folk in the old age village where she lived in, saying, from the opposition party, saying, oh, they're coming for your private homes now. And that's not helping. But that's the kind of politics that is in play right now. So I mentioned already the Constitutional Court. And this Constitutional Court, unlike the Supreme Court of the United States, was put in a position where it is given the power to decide. It specifically says in the Constitution that they get the last word on the meaning of the Constitution. Now, we say that's the case here, but we also have an argument here about other branches of government getting to interpret the Constitution. In South Africa, it's very clear the Constitutional Court is the final arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution. And the question is how far can they go? Because we have separation of powers, but can they tell Parliament what to do? Can they tell the President what to do? And we had a case just in August last year where the opposition parties were bringing a motion of no confidence in the President. Right? This was the previous President Zuma, which we'll talk about quite a bit in a moment. And the opposition parties, when they brought that, said, look, they're members of the majority party, of the ANC, who would be happy to vote against Zuma, because the party was fragmenting in this fight inside around Zuma's corruption. But they can't do it publicly because we have a system of proportional representation. Remember I said that electoral system is proportional representation? Proportional representation has its issues. Right? The issues are this. On one hand, it's more democratic than the way we do it. Right? Because it depends on what proportion of the House votes for what party, and they get that proportion in Parliament. So to that extent, it seems very democratic. Right? You're represented exactly by the numbers of people according to your votes. It's not first past the post, which is what we do. On the other hand, the downside is those individuals that are sitting there weren't elected by me, right? Because I just voted for the party. That gives the party bosses enormous power, right? Because essentially, they get to decide where you are on the list. So if the ANC won 54% in the first election, you know if you put on the top 50% of that list, you're going to Parliament, right? So now the party bosses decide to put you at 70 because you've been badly behaved. So you can see where the source of their power is. So it's very democratic in one hand, and it has its downside on the other side. And so the question becomes, with proportional representation, if we're going to have a vote in Parliament against the President, which is the head of the party, do you want to do that publicly? Right? You put your hand up, you know where you're going on the list next time round. Right? So the opposition parties argue that it only made sense that this vote should be in secret, should be a secret ballot. And what's interesting is the President of the country, who is elected by Parliament. So our executive, the President, unlike here, is not elected by the general population. It's a parliamentary system to the extent that the President is elected by Parliament, and then, of course, can be a vote of no confidence the President would have to resign. And so they argued that this should be a secret ballot. Now, who's going to decide that? Well, the Speaker of the House, right, just like here, has enormous power. Speaker of the House is very close to the President, so they weren't going to do that. So they went to court. They went to the Constitutional Court. And they said, it's only rational that this should be done in secret. Now, if we went to court here and asked the Supreme Court to tell the Speaker of the House that they've got to do X or Y, everybody would say, what are you talking about? That's separation of powers. You can't do that. And the South African court was caught in exactly that position, because they had to interpret the Constitution. They can't say, sorry, political question, which is what we do here. They say, no, we've got to deal with it. So what they said was that, well, it's up to the Speaker of the Parliament to regulate Parliament. They're not going to tell them what to do. But the Speaker of Parliament, as a constitutional official, has to behave rationally. And if they don't behave rationally, then you can bring the case back to the court. So she chose, rationally, to have a secret ballot. And the President was very nearly knocked out last August. So this court has enormous amount of power. It also, in terms of that, I mentioned the kind of symbolic notion that we have in South Africa. So I'm going to show you a set of slides now, a very quick little set of slides of the court, of the new court building. And if you think about it, African justice historically takes place under a big tree, right, in the village, the khotla, which is what it's called traditionally. And so this new building, the architecture tries to represent the khotla. There's the front of it. Constitutional court in all 11 languages on the front, right? Because after all, we have 11 official languages. Those on the right-hand side, those tall, that long line there are the doors, right, which go very, very high. And on the left there's the doors. And you can see a security thing to walk through below, so it'll give you a sense of perspective. These are solid pieces of wood that are carved, absolutely beautiful. And then inside, it's supposed to look like trees, so you can see the pillars inside. As you go through those doors, these are the pillars to look like trees. And on top, on the right-hand side, you can see these leaves that are in the trees and above, right? But think about this as, can you imagine the Supreme Court of the United States looking like this, right? This is really a new creative version of the world. And this is the court itself. And it's also interesting because the judges sit at that level behind those cow skins which are hanging down. Those are cattle skins, right, that are hanging down. The judges sit behind each of those. There are 11 justices on this court. But the people in front sit at exactly the same height as the judges. Right? The judges don't sit higher. Right? So a lot of symbol about what this court is supposed to be about. Anyway, after Mandela serves his term, and Mandela serves his term until 1999, that's the first 5-year term. In the middle of that period, de Klerk, now because it was proportional representation, one of the deals of this government of national unity was any party who received more than 20% of the vote had the right to a deputy presidency. Right? So the first government of national unity, Mandela's government, included de Klerk as a deputy president, not because we would be nice to de Klerk, because by the constitution he had a right to be there. And a second deputy president, who was Mbeki at the time, got to be there as well. Right? So each party, apart from the president, each party that got more than 20% got to have a deputy president. So we had 2 deputy presidents at first, F.W. de Klerk and Mbeki. De Klerk soon realized, so the old regime had this assumption in the negotiations that what it would mean to govern together would be that they would get a veto. And Mandela said, it doesn't work that way. It's a democratic government, and so we're going to decide by a majority. We're going to try and work it out together, but when it comes down to issues where we're going to have a break, the majority are going to win. And de Klerk went along with that and got a little frustrated after a while. So in 1997, de Klerk stepped down and said, and their party went into opposition. Right? It soon disintegrated. Very strangely, by 1999, the remnants of the National Party, the politicians, not the support base, the politicians joined the ANC, who they'd fought all their lives, but they went into the ANC. Their membership went to the opposition, right? Their party support base. But Mbeki then gets elected in 1999 as the next president of the country. And Mbeki's story, it's a rather sad story because, he didn't have the same, stepping into Mandela's boots was not going to be easy for anybody. But on the other hand, Mbeki also had some real difficulties. Right? He, incredibly bright man who basically believed he was brighter than most. He probably is. But certain things were inconvenient. And one of the things he found very inconvenient was that we were facing in South Africa at the time a very serious AIDS crisis, HIV/AIDS. Right? It had, in 1990, when the process had begun, it was just kicking off. And unlike how it presented initially in the United States, it was a heterosexual presentation initially in South Africa. Right? And as it kicked off in 1990, between 90 and 94, nobody was doing anything about it. Everybody was involved in the political struggles and process, and no attention was being paid to HIV/AIDS. By 94, this epidemic had gripped the country and was starting to take off. So the country very soon has to face, because of course the thing with HIV/AIDS, you can get infected and only 6 years later can you die, right? So what happens is by 1999, when Mbeki becomes president, the dying has begun, and people really are dying. 1996 is an important date because in 1996, antiretrovirals were finally functional, right? But the price of antiretrovirals at the time was $10,000 per patient per year. That's how much the drugs cost. South Africa could not afford that. Mbeki could not afford that. But he didn't have the gumption to stand up and say to the country, we're sorry, we can't actually help you. So he played a double game. On the one hand, he was fighting internationally, and South Africa played a major role in the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization to get what was eventually called the Doha Agreement, which finally allowed drugs in the developing countries' prices to drop. While they fought for cheaper drugs, at home, he denied that HIV caused AIDS. Right? And everybody, you may remember the bizarre stories he came out with. And so in that sense, he was a very tragic figure. It also meant that he never managed to finish his second term. Right? So in 1999, he gets elected. He gets re-elected in the next national election, where the ANC reaches the height of its electoral powers in the country. 67% of the vote, with a 76% turnout. Right? Real solid support. That's Mbeki. And yet, within a few years, he is thrown out of office. While he's in office, right? During his term. And that primarily because of the denial of HIV/AIDS. Because for the people in the country, you could stand on TV and deny all your life. We were dying, right? People are dying, and while people are dying, they can't be fooled by being told HIV doesn't cause AIDS, right? There was a cartoon at the time. Because Mandela, his son, Makato Mandela, which was the son of his first marriage, not with Winnie, but his first wife, died on the 6th of January 2005 of HIV/AIDS. And Mandela came out publicly and said so. Mandela went to an ANC National Executive Committee meeting at the time and challenged Mbeki. And they laughed at him. They said, old man, you're done now. Very tragic. But Mantu Shabalala, the health minister there behind Mbeki, was the woman who went to the AIDS conference in Toronto and said, you know, with garlic and oil and whatever we can fix AIDS. Very sad. But the result was that the social movements started getting going in South Africa. And a very successful social movement took on HIV/AIDS, the Treatment Action Campaign. The Treatment Action Campaign went to the Constitutional Court. And in December 14th, 2001, the court ruled that when it came to mother-to-child transmission, that the government had to, by law, distribute through the public health system, where 80% of South Africans get their health care, antiretroviral medicines, nevirapine. There's a socio-economic right in the Constitution to health care, and the court enforced it with respect to AIDS. And at that point, Mbeki was exposed, right? And he hung on there for a few years, but eventually he was knocked out. But why could that go on in the same way? Well, I want to turn to the opposition. And at the time, the opposition in South Africa remained dominated by white leadership, which is a little bizarre given the population of the country, right? And it explains why it was very hard to get any political opposition to the dominant party, to the ANC. Because dear Tony Leon, who I knew from college, was a perfectly nice gentleman, But how on earth could he, as a white South African, tell black South Africans that their leadership was no good? Right? He could say it all day long, but he had served in the white parliament, in the apartheid regime. He didn't have credibility. And one of the difficulties we have with democracy in South Africa is that the opposition party today, the Democratic Alliance, which is what he leads, or led, no longer has a white leader. There's now an African leader to that party. But constantly, the powers behind him are still all white. And in South Africa, that's just not real, right? They may have the money, and therefore they think they call the shots. But that doesn't get you the vote, right? And that's a weakness for the whole democratic system, because unless we have an effective and strong opposition, then the majority party doesn't have a check, right? And that's been a serious, serious weakness. So as much as I like Tony, he did us a disfavor by sticking around until May 2007 before he decided to resign. And when he resigned, he handed it over to a woman by the name of Helen Ziller, who's a white journalist, who stayed in power until 3 years ago, when finally Musi was given the job. So that is a real limit to our opposition politics in South Africa, because that's the majority. There are a number of small, very small black opposition parties, but they're not really real. But what happened with Mbeki? Well, let me show you the population stuff for a second. So there is the population in South Africa in 2001, right? 44 million people, 44.8 million people, 52% are women, 48% male. There's a growth rate of 1.8%. But once you start looking at how that breaks down, right? 79% African. Colored, 9%, is people of mixed race. People, mostly, that's the community that came out of the original slave population in the Western Cape, right? That population primarily speaks Afrikaans, right, in the Western Cape. In other parts of the country, they may be English speaking. Trevor Noah comes from that community, right? Asian or Indian, 2.4%. White, 9.6%, right? That's in 2001. So with those kind of population figures, to think that a white person can lead the political opposition is just smoking something. So when Mbeki gets pushed out, Kgalema Motlanthe gets appointed, right, by the parliament, because in South Africa, the parliament can elect a president. So when Mbeki resigns, he resigns under pressure from the ANC. The ANC tell him, you're gone. So he resigns. And when he does that, and we're going to see this again because we've had 5 presidents, 2 of whom have not fulfilled their terms. They've been told to walk, right? So not from the democratic process, but from within the ruling party, right? So Mbeki gets told, you're no longer acceptable to the party. He resigns, and they put in Kgalema, who I think, if he had been allowed to stay, would have made an excellent president. He was, for the 8 months that he was president, he did a very good job. He began turning around the process. But the pressure on Mbeki didn't come from him. The pressure on Mbeki came from Jacob Zuma. And Jacob Zuma is a complicated character. On the left, you see him in his populist mode in front of political rallies. And, well, sorry, on your left. And on your right, you see him as a traditional leader presenting himself as an isiZulu warrior. And he played that game of being both a traditionalist, appealing to the isiZulu majority, as well as being a populist. And as a populist, what he did was he promised, right, this was in the lead up to the fight against Mbeki, he promised that he would deal with HIV/AIDS. Right? It's not a surprise that people supported him. He promised all sorts of socioeconomic benefits that would flow. He came from an extremely poor background. His mother was a domestic worker. He spent many years in prison. He learnt to read and write for the first time on Robben Island in prison. So he had that background. But he's also a, he also has 5 wives. He had one wife divorced him. Another wife died in exile, committed suicide. But he has 5 wives now, right? So those were prior wives. And he has, of course, children to go with that. So he has a large family. But he wasn't a rich man at all, right? And that, of course, is going to begin to tell us another tale, because once he becomes president with all the promises, he also has needs, or so he thinks. So in the election where he gets elected in 2009, it's with 65.9% of the vote. Right? The Democratic Alliance, that opposition party, got 17% of the vote. Right? So the ANC is a very dominant party, even when he first gets elected. And just to give you a sense of the, what is actually at issue. Right? So here is a graph that shows you on the far left-hand side for you, piped water. Now it shows you 2 periods, 1996, just after the government, only 2 years into the democracy, and 2004. Right? So they managed to push pipe water up. Unimproved water is very low. Flush toilets, right? For just over 40% of the population. But now we're talking about the African population on the left. Right? That's 80% of the population. If you compare that to the right-hand side, which is white, colored, and Asian, in other words, the 3 minorities in the country, who are the remaining 20%. There you have nearly 100% of all these resources, right? Access. So this is about access. This access is not just, and this is urban and rural. And if we flip over, you can see it in, there's a distinction between rural and urban. And in the rural areas, as you can see, there's still only less than 30% access to piped water. There's still lots of unimproved water, in other words, raw water. There's very little in the way of flush toilets. There's pit latrines, 70% of the population. No toilet, still 20-something%. There is now more electricity, 60%, but only for lighting, for cooking, etc. It's still about 12%. And as you can see, services like refuse removal, etc., is next to nothing. You compare that to the urban areas, and it's very different. So you've got this massive set of inequalities that are ongoing. And this is what, number one, allows Zuma's populism to dominate, but also is a threat to the democratic system. That if you have this kind of level of inequality that comes down to these basic things in daily life, not to emphasize that we have 30% unemployment. 30% unemployment. So those are real consequences. And in the midst of that, Jacob Zuma, as president, decides he needs a security upgrade on his rural property. So there's the private home that was constructed as a security upgrade. 250 million rand went to security upgrade. What was interesting about this is an example of the kind of corruption that then starts flourishing under Zuma. Right? Because when he leads the way with this, why would anybody below think that they can't do it too? Right? So we have this real development of corruption during this period. As you can see, it's rural KwaZulu-Natal. It's very beautiful, the mountains in the background, but if you the village around this has got nothing, right? But, you know, it's the big man theory. Look what I can eat. But we have institutions. Here's one of my favorite ones. There's Thuli Madonsela. Now, she was a young lawyer when I first met her at the University of the Witwatersrand when I started working there. She had been an activist in the anti-apartheid struggle as well. And Zuma appointed her, just after he came into office, he appointed her to this position of public protector. Public protector is a constitutional institution in South Africa. So just like I showed you how the court emerges as an institution, we also created in the Constitution a set of institutions which are called the institutions to protect democracy. They include the Auditor General, the Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, there's 9 of them altogether, the Independent Electoral Commission. So the elections in South Africa are run by an independent commission, not by the government, not by the political parties. So we attempted to create these constitutional entities that could facilitate and enable democracy. And so here was the challenge. Right? We're getting this incredible level of corruption. He appoints Thuli Madonsela, a very quietly spoken woman. She was a loyal ANC member. And he totally assumed that she would behave herself. But Thuli turns out to have a backbone of steel. I mean, they went after her. And she just proceeded to unveil all this corruption, starting with Nkandla. So here you see the new head of the Democratic Alliance on the left, Mmusi Moyane. There's Jacob Zuma. Here's the Public Protector, and there's a new young man by the name of Julius Malema, who was the head of the ANC's Youth League until they threw him out because he was outrageous, and there was a good reason to kick him out of the party. But then he formed his own party, the Economic Freedom Front, which takes pretty extreme positions, but because Zuma threw him out, he hates Zuma, so he's been really interesting in terms of the way he's gone after Zuma ever since. But here they're talking about Nkandla. The interesting thing is Madonsela very quietly just said, look, the Constitution says that I get to investigate corruption and good governance. And here it is. I've done the investigation, and here's what the numbers show. This money was all spent, and yes, of course, he's the president of the country. We had to do some security upgrade on his property. But not what he did. So he owes back half the money. Now, as we know, he's strapped already, right? He's got 5 wives, 5 sets of children. Life's a little tough, even though he's president. And so he doesn't want to pay back the money. He probably can't pay back the money. And he has tax consequences, of course, if he gets somebody else to pay it back for him. So Zuma's running into trouble. And this little issue of Nkandla begins to gather momentum in the country. Right? Julius Malema, wherever he talks, runs around the country going, pay back the money. Right? He's just quoting Madonsela, right? But pay back the money. That's all he says. Pay back the money. And every time we have the State of the Union, here we call it State of the Union, there they call it State of the Nation speech, the president goes to Parliament to open Parliament, Malema won't let him. They just shout and scream while he's standing there until they get physically removed from Parliament. The whole country has to sit and watch this on TV for hours as they fight. Right? But the point is the legitimacy of the president was slowly but surely undermined. Right? So that his own party began to realize that he was an albatross around their neck, and they needed to get rid of him. And that's precisely what they proceed to do. Now, just to give you a sense of that, I meant to have numbers here and I didn't. I wanted to talk a little bit about local government. There's not enough time for it now, but one of the problems in South Africa was we decide in the constitutional process to have the democracy as close to the people as possible. So South Africa, here we have states and we have the national government in the constitution. right? But local government here, it depends what Madison says, right? It's the state legislature that defines local government. In South Africa, local government is a third level of government in the Constitution. And local government has constitutional powers. And also, it has all the authority to do most of the development stuff at the base level, supposedly with the people. One of the problems with that, of course, is politicians tend to rise like, you know. So all the top politicians went to Parliament. And who got to be local government politicians? Not so good. And so the corruption really got going at the bottom level. But with the Nkandla thing on top of it, so we had local government elections in 2016. And the ANC, who had won, by 2006, had 66.3% of the local government vote, dropped down to 53% in 2016. And as a result, and where did they lose? As a result, so these red areas here are the major metropolitan areas of South Africa, the urban areas, where first of all, a lot of the resources are already, you've seen that, but also where the vast majority of the population lives now. Under apartheid, they had a pass system, which meant that Africans who were supposed to be living in those homelands at 13%, had to have a document on them 24 hours a day, giving them a right to be in the urban area, right, an internal passport. When that system broke down and then finally was got rid of, you had a mass process of movement into the cities. Right? So the cities around South Africa today have these large informal settlements, so-called squatter areas, because we've had mass movement into the cities. So even though the government has produced millions of new houses, it's not nearly enough, given the amount of urbanization we've had. But it's those urban areas now that are revolting. Right? So if you look at those areas, yes, somebody said I could show with a, yeah, okay. So there's Tshwane, which is Pretoria, the capital of the country. That area now is governed by the opposition after the local government elections. They didn't win outright, but they won enough to get together, right? The DA and the Economic Forum got together and formed the government of Tshwane. Johannesburg, the economic powerhouse of the country, governed now by the opposition. Ekurhuleni, the ANC managed to put a coalition to still control that little area there. Durban, eThekwini is ANC dominated. That's Zuma's home base. That Nkandla area is up here. Mangaung is also ANC. Very, very corrupt. Not too many people there anyway. Buffalo City, still ANC. Nelson Mandela Bay, now controlled by the opposition. And Cape Town's been controlled by the opposition for the last 10 years. So for the ANC, they could read the writing on the wall, right? When the main urban areas start going all to the opposition, and you start losing, you're down to 53% of the total, and you've got elections coming in 2019, you have to be sure that something's going wrong. It's in that context, and then of course what's going wrong is these are the streets, but they are all focused on Zuma. And the ANC, of course, hopes if they get rid of Zuma, then maybe they stand a chance. And that's precisely what happens, right? So the ANC then moves. So the interesting thing is, because we still have a two-term system in terms of leadership, both as president, right? We have limited terms, so the president can only serve 2 terms. So if Zuma had finished his term, he wouldn't be up for re-election anyway. But the party itself had developed a culture of only 2 terms. Mandela had only taken 1 term. And we'd hoped that that pattern would develop, but 2 terms, okay. So Mbeki had 2 terms. Part of Mbeki's mistake, he tried to stand for a 3rd term within the party. He couldn't be president, but he still wanted to run the party. But that's when he lost to Zuma. Zuma understood that, and so Zuma wasn't going to stand a 2nd time. So in this last December, was the time for Zuma to step down as president of the party, not the government, not the country. And so what he tried to do was he tried to put his former wife, now this is really complicated, not his wife, one of his existing wives, but the one who divorced him, who's been South Africa's foreign minister and in fact head of the African Union for some time. She's a very impressive woman, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, and he tried, but he's, you know, they have kids together, so he thought she's not going to get him locked up, right? So he pushed her, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who you see there taking the oath of office to become the new president of South Africa now in February, he won that election by 179 votes out of 5,000 votes, right? The election within the party. So the party is still incredibly divided, right? But he was running on an anti-corruption ticket. In other words, he was running directly against the Zuma crowd in the party, right? Now he only won by 179 votes, but he's now president of the country. And so things begin to move. So let me talk briefly about, we won't worry about these, this is just population stuff again. State of capture. So if Nkandla presents a nice example of just good old corruption, state capture is a much more interesting thing. And this was the last report written by Thuli Madonsela when she finished her 7-year term as public protector. So public protector is a constitutional position, 7 years, and then you've got to get a new one, right? You can't retake the position. So she came to the end of her 7 years. Zuma didn't make a mistake the second time. He put in a real dud, right, who's now in position. Well, she's probably going to get thrown out, but she's in position right now. But on her way out the door, Thuli issues this report, State of Capture. State of Capture talks about a different process. This is a process where people are going to use the law and use the legal structures to make corruption. Right? And it's led by these three gentlemen, the Gupta brothers. The Gupta brothers have a really interesting little history because they're not South Africans. They come from India. They arrive in South Africa in 1993-94. And they have a set of skills which most South Africans don't have. They've brought up in the governance system of a Uttar Pradesh in India, which is a notoriously corrupt state in India. And they know how the system works. And they introduce it to us. Thank you. And the three of them, they start out, they first, I mean, it's amazing, they arrive in South Africa and they're selling shoes. Right? They don't have much, they don't have any capital or anything. They're selling shoes. But very quickly, they work out that in their hometown, there's a multinational corporation called Sahara Computers, which is a serious Indian computer company. So they open a company in South Africa called Sahara Computers. And everybody thinks they represent that company, but of course they have nothing to do with it. And they proceed to raise capital based on the fact that they're supposedly that company. And the three of them then immediately bring on board for their company one of the sons of Jacob Zuma. Because they're clever, they know how you do this. You don't go and try to bribe the president, you just bring his son on board in the company. So Dumisani Zuma is now their partner, and they immediately start going to the government procurement agencies and start offering to do whatever procurement there is. And each time they drop, well, you know, they're in with Zuma. So Zuma doesn't even have to say anything at first because, you know, it's just they're in with Zuma. They've proceeded to take over. So one of the legacies of apartheid is the old apartheid regime ran very large public corporations. Electricity, all the major utilities, all were public companies. And they've continued. Well, public companies have boards that are appointed by the political process. So what these guys did was they got Zuma to appoint their friends onto the boards of these companies, which would then give them procurement. Right? So they just worked from the inside. They worked to the point where they actually became billionaires in no time at all. they started to make some mistakes. Their first mistake was they had a wedding of some niece, a nephew of theirs or whatever from India. So they flew in 200 guests from India, but they didn't bother to bring them through the regular airport where they would have to go through customs. They flew them into an Air Force base and then just drove them off to this hotel. The rest of the country said, hang on a second, how did that happen? Well, because the president, somebody in the presidency had made it happen. So people said, hang on, what's going on here? So that was their first little mistake. Then some journalists turned up at a farm in the Free State and found 30 cattle dead. So what's this about? Then they found, oh, the Guptas were supposedly investing in this farm. So why is there these dead cows and nothing? And this farm was supposed to be for poor black farmers. This was supposed to be bringing in a new generation of black farmers. They were all supposed to get so many cows and they were training and all the rest of it. But it turned out it was a pass-through from the local agricultural department, which they had colonized, through this farm, $20 million that went to pay for the wedding. And they started digging this up, right? And the journalists, and so the one benefit of South Africa is we have a very active civil society, a constitutionally protected press, and started going after these guys. And as more and more evidence started coming up, so it started getting closer and closer to the Zuma world. So we had in Nkandla, we have a prior case where Zuma's facing charges based on what was called the arms deal, which was a corrupt thing from very early on. And now we have state capture. So I'll end off with, I'll flip through these last two. I'll end off with where we are today. We've just had appointed the Deputy Chief Justice, Ray Zondo. They have a commission to investigate state capture. This was a remedy, constitutional remedy, that Thuli Madonsela had put in her final report, which they then fought. They didn't want to do. It had to go up to the court again and again, but the court insisted that that report had to be implemented. So now we have a commission of inquiry at the moment when politics have shifted, and the result is they're in trouble. The Gupta boys are on the run. They've left the country, they're in Dubai. They've taken a lot of money with them, but so the show goes on. The interesting thing is, why I say what's interesting to me, and where I'll finish and open up for questions now, is we have these institutions that were created by the Constitution that, despite this rather horrendous period, have hung in there and have started to actually function the way they should. Now, nothing is ever guaranteed in politics, as we know, but the fact that these institutions are functioning, that this information has all come out, that the government can't just close it down, which is what the old regime did all the time, is something where I know the talk was supposed to be South Africa's fragile democracy. I think it is. Democracy is fragile, but institutions can be sticky. Right? Institutions actually can function. And what's fascinating to me is that these institutions, which are still very new, right? They were only created in 1996. They took time to establish and build. At times they've kind of had bad leadership and have bumped along. But in fact, they've become sticky. That people have a faith in them and they actually start to function. And hopefully we'll see the results. But I'm open to questions.
Just a quick reminder, since we have limited time because we want to fit cake in also at the end of the evening for your birthday, please stay aware that we're only going to get one question in per person tonight because we only have about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes for questions. So, and remember, no one gets cake who doesn't play nice with each other. So
that's very nice. I'm not worried.
It's a very hollow threat.
I had the first question here. 1, 2, 3. So let's go.
There you go.
The Constitutional Court Is that appointed or elected?
The Constitution, there's a process. There is a National Judicial Commission that people are nominated from the public. And then they go through the public interviews, and then the commission, which is a combination. There's the private bars on the commission, the law professors have representatives, the university law schools have a representative, the government has various representatives. It's all lawyer dominated. But they nominate, and they have to nominate 3 persons for each one appointment. And the president gets to pick from those 3. Right? No, they are 11-year terms. No, sorry, 15-year terms. At one term, they're not allowed to be reappointed. 15 years, 1 term, and it's 11. There's 11 justices in the court. Now, what's happened is they were initially appointed for 11 years, and there was an extension that was set up in the new constitution. But as people have passed away early or retire, whatever, they choose. And now it's basically people can stay until they're 70 years old. So again, if they're appointed, maybe they're not going to be there for 15 years. Depends on the age of their appointment.
Very small question, but why did the cows die? Were they just neglected?
They were neglected, yeah. Yeah. No, they're just. This wasn't meant. Was never set up properly. I mean, it was just a face so that they could get the money and get the money. Yeah. Sorry, there's one over there, and then that gentleman.
Okay. You said a couple of times, I think, that the population, the white population, was between 8 and 9%.
Has dropped from 9% to 7.9 now.
Okay. And is 9% about as high as it has been, say, throughout the 20th century? Was there ever a time when the white population in South Africa reached as high as, say, 20%?
Well, okay, so they used to claim 20 to 25%, but that's because they claimed that those other areas weren't South Africa. So they didn't count the black people. So that didn't work so well. But it was probably, genuinely, it was probably as high as 15% at some point. So there's, my last slide, which I would have showed you, where is that? Is an interesting slide, because it's about immigration into and out of South Africa. And those are the numbers, if you look from 1996 when the new constitution till the press, and the last one, 2016 to 21, is obviously estimations. But you see that white folks are leaving. There's a small influx of people from Asia and India, but from all over Africa, there's a massive influx. Right? In fact, we've had about 5 million people from across Africa since 1990. Many refugees and others. So the country is changing in that sense.
Yes, early in your presentation you mentioned, or you showed a slide of the first democratic voting in 1994, and then you mentioned later on that there was a 76% voter turnout. With 11 languages and 19 plus political parties, you know, one of the dangers of a democracy, one of the dangerous elements is the uninformed voter. How can these voters all be informed? And to go along with that, do these informed voters care if the leader of a certain party is black or white, if they stand for the right principles?
In a post-colonial context like South Africa, of course those things, that is what's going to matter, who represents. And it's not a matter of principles. It is a matter of history. So, unfortunately, in all post-colonial situations we've seen around the world, the party that fights for freedom is a very dominant party. Right? The Indian Congress in India, the PRI in Mexico, the ANC in South Africa, when they come to power as the party that achieved freedom, they have years of legitimacy. And that's a problem. There's no question that that's a... So we have I call South Africa a dominant party democracy. Because the ANC dominates, not because the individual voters are informed, etc., but because Mandela, he took us to freedom. I still vote for Mandela. That's the attitude, right? Now, what's fascinating is what you see with Zuma is people going, not that, thank you very much. And what's interesting is people are informed at that level, right? I mean, when you see this kind of corruption, it's not hard to be informed. We do have a very active press, black press, white press, I mean, a lot of, right across all languages. There's radio in all languages. So people are surprisingly informed about issues. And so that's why when the ANC saw that 53% in the 1996, I mean in the 2016 local government election, they knew it wasn't going to stop there. It was going to keep on plummeting. That's why they're trying desperate. I mean, with Ramaphosa coming in, a totally different faction of the ANC has taken control. The faction that actually were the constitutionalists, the people who were committed to the constitutional structure. Now, can they clean it up in time before next June to actually get the vote majority? It's not clear yet. Right? If Zuma goes on trial, it's possible. And it's possible that he will go on trial. So, but the tension within the party at the moment is unbelievable. Right? In all these public statements, you see people who are in Zuma's side talking about unity. The most important thing is unity, which means don't go after us, right? So that it's not resolved. Not resolved at all. I mean, to that extent, there's still enormous fragility. What interests me is how the institutions have managed to keep a grip, despite the fact that you've got the political process being as fragile as it has. So over here.
Right here.
You live in Madison. Do you see any reflection of South Africa in our government?
I think that's a pointed question. Look, I teach constitutional law. And so my concern about institutions and about, I mean, the presidency is a concern, right? When we're doing things in ways that we haven't done them before. That's a concern. Because institutions, but on the other hand, I also, just like the story I've told, I believe institutions are quite resilient. And so even when you get somebody who's prepared to play outside the regular tracks, that doesn't destroy the institutions just like that. There's a lot of paranoia about, oh, the institutions have been destroyed. And I go, yeah, institutions are sticky. So a lot of damage can be done. Let's not fool ourselves. But, I mean, so at the moment in South Africa, we've got this real problem. The social security grants are how a large part of the population now survives. So one of the things the ANC did, whites used to get social security in the old regime, and they extended that to everybody. And one of the most important shifts of resources has happened by making sure that we don't have starving children in South Africa anymore, which is what we used to have. Right? We used to have kwashiorkor, which is a particular disease of, when you see those photos of African babies with pot bellies, etc., right? That's a disease called kwashiorkor. And that disease is wiped out of South Africa, right? So but it's been done through social welfare, by redirecting tax dollars, right? The social security system turned out that, of course, Zuma's appointed person in there learned that there's a lot of money going around. And so they created a very corrupt system in terms of how that controlled the distribution. And we're just siphoning off. Formally, right? The contract to do the distribution was worth a lot of money. And the Constitutional Court came in and said that contract was not correctly done. Right? Struck down the contract. And that department kept on going, well, we don't have an alternative, and have kept the contract in place for 3 more years, despite the court order. Right? And the court's gone in now and said, this is ending now. But the threat, of course, is if they can't do it, all these people won't receive their money. So there's so there you've got a situation where an institution, the fact that it's failing is really serious. Right? It can do an enormous amount of damage. But at the same time, you now see this incredible mobilization from within the new government now and within the courts to say, we're going to fix it. We're going to fix it right now. Same happened with the water story in Cape Town. Right? The sad story is the opposition party has been in control of Cape Town for the last decade or more. And they used to say, well, the Western Cape is better governed because we govern it. Well, it ain't looking so good when the taps are about to run dry. No, it's not all their fault, right? When the water doesn't come from up there, they can't be blamed. Yeah. But 17 years ago, they were told, in 2018, you're going to run out of water. Literally, the hydrologists told them, this is what's going to happen. And they did nothing about it. Nothing. So they got to take some of the political heat for having done nothing about it. But interesting enough, the response now has been extraordinary. So day 0, which was what they called the day when we were going to run out of water in the taps, got extended, 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 and now it's probably only going to be next year. Right? How did it get extended? The population of the Western Cape has increased by 30% since 1990. Because you took away those internal passports, people come to the city. Right? But what they were able to do was by encouraging people to conserve water, they were able to keep the amount of consumption the same as it was before the 30% arrived. So they thought they were doing everything that needed to be done. And then they got a drought. And suddenly, right? So they had to do more than that. And whether they're going to do that in time, we still don't know. Right? Because now it's probably desalination is the option, and that's incredibly expensive. Very, very difficult to do. Right? But that's a serious problem.
Question over here.
Can you talk a little bit about the matter of public safety and violent crime, please?
Sure. We've been through waves of violent crime since 1990. The first thing that happened was the way policing used to work in South Africa used to be based exactly on the fact that we had segregated world. And so the way they used to police was they didn't bother to find out who committed the crime. They just kept certain people out of certain areas. So we had very high crime rates historically in the black areas. And very little crime in the white areas because there was a barrier. Right? The police, any black person out of step in the white areas would be jumped. Right? So that was the old apartheid policing system. Worked quite effectively, but of course it didn't work for the majority of the population. 1990, they take away the internal passport. They can't stop anybody on the street anymore. Crime just sweeps across the country, really significantly. And with the levels of inequality, yeah, you want to know where the goods are? That's out of town, right? So that kind of crime rate in the early 1990s was absolutely, we had incredible car hijackings, it got really, really bad. And because there'd been a civil war going on, the amount of weaponry around, and people know how to use it, so we had all these attacks on the cash moving opera, what are they called? Like brinks here, right? We had all these attacks on these brinks, on the armored vehicles carrying cash. Really serious stuff. Interesting enough, from Mbeki's area right through Zuma's area, they managed to get that down, right? Quite significantly. You still have real issues going on in rural areas. So the way it gets presented to the world now is, oh, it's about land, and it's about the fact that these white farmers are being killed and it's because of land reform. But when one looks a little closer, you've got a couple of things going on. You still have this incredible inequality, and you have these white farmers, very isolated, alone, in the middle of nowhere. And they are sitting ducks in terms of the wealth they've got compared to the people around them. Add to that the fact that many of them, sadly, treated their labor in ways that were pretty horrendous in the past, and continue to do so in some cases. So we had a case last year where 2 white farmers had a wage dispute with one of their employees. Got a little out of hand, and so a few weeks later they grabbed this individual, they chopped him up beat him up with machetes, and then threw him over there was a game farm nearby, and they threw him over the wire into the lion enclosure, and he got eaten by the lions. And then you wonder why the population is a little unhappy. Right? We've had numerous cases like this with brutality by white farm managers, particularly on black labor. That went on right through apartheid, and of course nobody did anything about it. Now the population ain't going to tolerate it. And then people take it into their own hands. So it's not a perfectly pretty picture in that regard. What's amazing is how little of it's still going on. Right? You get these horrendous cases, but in terms of the numbers on that, crime in South Africa at the moment is down.
I could say,
I had a question about I had a question about the Pretoria area you were talking about. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah. Did I hear correctly the Democratic Alliance is in coalition or working with the economic freedom fighters?
Correct.
Could you talk a little bit more about that odd situation?
Yeah, it is an odd situation, and not just there. They're in the Eastern Cape, Nelson Mandela Bay, they're in the same position, and in Johannesburg, they're in the same position. And what it is in all three cases, the Democratic Alliance got more votes than so the ANC got, in some areas, the ANC got more votes, but between the other two, they could put a government together. And the Economic Freedom Front is so angry at the ANC that they throw their votes to the DA. Yeah. So they like to play kingmaker. But it's incredibly unstable because they don't agree on anything. And every now and again, Malema threatens to throw the DA out. So in Nelson Mandela Bay, they're now throwing out the white mayor that was elected by the DA. That
reminds me of Northern Ireland, Democratic Unionist Protestants working with Sinn Féin Catholics.
Well, yeah, sure.
It's interesting. That's how you get things done. You sort of...
It'd be good if we... Well, that's the story of South Africa. Not just this case, right? I mean, the National Party members who work with the ANC. I mean, that's the same story. Yeah. No, we have a lot. There has been an extraordinary amount of that crossing and ability to work together post-1990. Right? I mean, some people talk about it as a miracle, and in many ways it is. Yeah. It doesn't mean it's pretty or easy. Right?
In the name of celebrating someone's arrival on Earth, that will be our last question. But a huge round of applause for a great lecture by Professor Klug. Cake and the birthday girl are right up front. We got plates, we got forks, and someone willing to cut the cake, so that all works out. Have a great evening, everyone.
Happy birthday.